I'm just going to spend literally a few minutes talking through formally how we can think about some of these issues of exclusion, barriers to access that we've just experienced really physically ourselves. If we're thinking about barriers to access in public employment programs, in training programs, in employment placement, we can kind of think about these in different ways. One is actually physical exclusion. You can't get physically access to these kind of programs. They're too far away, that the location of the work is too remote from where you are. It could be a physical exclusion because the type of work is something that you can't do. You physically have certain limitations, perhaps, so you can't do certain kinds of work. So that physical limitation could be spatial, or it could be to do with your own individual capacity. So that's a very kind of practical barrier to access. Another major one, which relates to gender and disability, is to do with social attitudes. And this is a two-way thing. Program designers, community members may exclude you either deliberately or by not considering your particular needs. But also, there may be a high degree of self-exclusion, because in many communities, people are so marginalized, they may not choose to put themselves forward. And that applies not only to gender and disability, but also to specific groups within a community. Stanley mentioned one way of getting access to the community is community meetings. But what we see internationally is that in many contexts, there are marginalized groups who may not even participate in community meetings. This may be due to their ethnicity, their religion, they may be migrants. We do see that outsiders, people who are considered outsiders, often aren't included in community practices. They aren't included in discussions, and they may be excluded from programs. Even where you have quite effective community allocation of resources, often these outsider groups are just considered excludable. It's acceptable to exclude certain groups. So it's in a way a kind of cultural or social norm. It's very important to bear that in mind. And another barrier to access is when access is rationed, when what you're offering is a very scarce resource, access to a job, access to training. And unfortunately, there's quite well-documented evidence that there's all kinds of exploitation which can occur in terms of trying to get access to these jobs, which may be a disincentive. There was some horrible material, I don't know if our colleague from NREGA is familiar with it, but there was well-documented cases of women wanting to get access to NREGA public employment programs, and they had to engage in sex with the person who was allocating employment in order to get into the program. So I think that's a particular example, but there are all kinds of ways in which people try to extract rent, try to extract things from vulnerable groups who otherwise wouldn't have access to the program. So this is really quite a major issue. So let's look at some of the challenges which relate to domestic responsibilities, because this is a very, very prevalent issue, and it came up yesterday. One major factor is if you are responsible for the welfare of others, it's hard for you to take that time to participate in additional work activities. If you're caring for children, for the disabled, for the elderly, for the sick. And this is particularly an issue in households where you've got limited domestic labor. Where there's plentiful labor in a household, this isn't such an issue, you can reallocate. But if you have limited labor in your household, the opportunity cost of participating in these programs can be very high, and it can be very difficult. And what that means is that actually you often increase the labor burden on participants because they're trying to combine additional work activities with their domestic responsibilities. There are interesting consequences of this. You often see the dropout of the poorest. So even when programs are successful and get the poorest in, you tend to find a much higher dropout rate among those who are facing these kind of pressures. Another thing you see is the reallocation of labor within the household. That's fine if you have plentiful labor, but if in fact you have limited labor, you may pass your domestic responsibilities onto your children or other older family members, which may be problematic. And again, there's evidence of children coming out of school in order to cover domestic responsibilities so that parents can participate in employment programs. So this has to be considered. Another problem in some context is that people need income, immediate income from these kind of programs. so they stop investing in their own productive employment. This is particularly an issue where you have agricultural work which may be neglected because instead you're wanting the returns from the public employment, the more rapid returns from the public employment program. The alternative, of course, is you bring your children with you. You don't leave them behind, you don't get another child to take care of them, you bring them with you. And there's a very high incidence of dangerous work sites having children with them. Yesterday we didn't see that, there were no children at the plant, but there's plenty of places where people bring their children along with them into very dangerous work environments. So there's a number of challenges there. I mean, the positive outcome is people use their income to employ additional labor to help them in their domestic responsibilities or their productive responsibilities. So it can have a positive impact, but very often we see these kind of challenges. Okay, so how can social protection address exclusion? Now, we could have a whole conference on these issues, but I just wanted to pull out a few examples to inspire our thinking. One is the provision of complementary programs. One is taking account of people's needs carefully in program design, and the other is looking at the quality of the way you implement programs. So I'll just give you a couple of examples, then I'll stop. I mean, perhaps the most obvious thing is to provide some kind of childcare or creche which takes care of somebody's domestic responsibilities while they're working, or the provision of care for other kinds of dependents. And interestingly, this can be included and incorporated into employment programs. I mean, both in NREGA and, where's Stanley? Yeah, and in the EPWP and Pearl, we have examples of home-based care. We have examples of creche provision. So there are ways in which these kind of factors which can limit female participation have been incorporated into programs as an additional way of absorbing labor. Let's just talk about a few design issues. If you're looking at public employment programs, there are all kinds of initiatives which have been taken. One is to have single gender work groups. That's particularly important where women feel vulnerable or there are religious reasons why it's difficult for them to participate in the labor market if there may be mixed-sex working groups. Another is the provision of security. Sometimes people are just frightened to work, particularly marginalized groups, so perhaps having security in place can help. Limiting the distance of the work from the home base, making sure that people have access to work which they can get to readily. I think in India they limit the distance of the work provision from the home base to 5 kilometers, deliberately to address this challenge. Also flexibility of working hours. If you can work flexibly, it's much more easy to combine your employment with your other responsibilities, or even other ad hoc employment opportunities if they come up. Because sometimes these work programs mean that people have to give up existing ad hoc opportunities that they get. But if you can work flexibly, as with our rubbish collectors yesterday, this is a great benefit. Also, another factor is if you're sick, if you're disabled, if you have caring responsibilities, you may not always be able to come to the work site. So allowing alternates to come in your place is a way of really accommodating those difficulties of regularly engaging in a workplace. Another factor is payment frequency. Some programs pay people every 2 months. Now, if you're extremely poor and you need rapid returns to your labor, you can't afford to wait 2 months to be paid. This is a major problem, particularly in donor-funded programs. So you need to think about the frequency of remuneration to be sure that the poorest can afford to participate. The other thing is the adequacy of the wage rate. And what we see is that some programs pay the wage rate which is the lowest in the prevailing labor market. And often the lowest wage in a prevailing labor market can be really quite exploitative. So simply replicating that in your employment programs is problematic. It doesn't make it an attractive program for people to participate in, and can mean that you're employing people on conditions which are really very poor, and that your program becomes part of that adverse incorporation problem. And then this issue of the transparency of the selection process. Yes, sorry, I mentioned that on day one. I'm expecting you to have total recall of everything I've ever said. Yeah, adverse incorporation is when people are working, they're part of the economy, but they're paid at such a poor rate that it's below their subsistence needs. And that's the prevalent situation for the majority of workers in many of our countries. And the risk is that if you set the wage, the remuneration in these programs at that very low level, perhaps the casual wage labor level, you're not even providing these households with enough resources to feed themselves. And there's horrible evidence of people, sick people, ill people, poor people working in programs and actually not earning enough to even feed themselves and replace the calories that they use up each day. So clearly these kind of programs can be really quite negative, and there's a disincentive effect to participate if that's what you're offering. The final issue is the transparency of selection. If access is highly rationed, if it's not clear who is eligible, then you get into this horrible situation where there can be exploitation, sexual exploitation, other kinds of exploitation, when people are trying to get access to employment. So some kind of transparency and community understanding of who is eligible can really help to address those kind of gender issues. And when we're talking about the quality of implementation, I think maybe a major factor is reliability. If somebody decides to invest their precious time in a program and they're not paid when they should be paid, this can lead to many problems, particularly problems of indebtedness, problems of the credibility of the program. And in fact, payment reliability is a major problem in employment programs. Many of them don't have a regular stream of payment, again, particularly donor-funded programs. And that can be a major problem in terms of inclusion of the poorest. If you work, you have to be sure that you'll get remuneration for your labor. And if there's uncertainty about that, there's a risk of participating. Okay, social protection has a tremendous impact overall on gender and inclusion issues. Where you have these programs, you see quite a significant increase in female participation in the labor market. You also see an increase in the bargaining power. If people know that they've got some kind of income as a backup, then they can bargain much more effectively in the labor market. And I'm sure we'll hear about examples from India, where actually it's put a floor into the labor market and pushed up the casual wage labor rate, and even led to some equalization between male and female remuneration. Very interesting. It can also really address some of these issues of marginalization. In South Africa, we have examples of very poor communities who've really improved in terms of their self-esteem, in terms of their respect within the community through participation in these programs. But equally, in some countries, participation in this program is seen as demeaning. So it can exacerbate the feelings of marginalization among the poor. It all depends how it's presented and how it's sold to the broader community. So the take-home message is you need to take the social context into account when you're designing these programs, and you need to think about the barriers that are faced by all of these different groups, as Juliet said, because the different groups will have different barriers which affect their access to employment. Thank you. I hope that just gives you some experience from the international work.